We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law.
We need to safeguard financial stability.
2024 is not going to be an easy year.
We used to call it the dream of home ownership, but look at Britain now.
We've got to hang on to optimism and hope because it is the biggest driver of change.
Let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit. Let's move on and look to the future.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Now we're taking a metaphorical snowmobile and driving into the US presidential election today, starting with the Iowa caucuses later, because no matter how special the US-UK relationship right now is, the occupant of the White House will undoubtedly have a profound effect on the UK's fortunes.
Yeah, of course, going to shape foreign policy crucially in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, in Southeast Asia, and it will have an effect on economy and trade.
Yeah, we were speaking to the Bloomberg opinion columnist Adrian Wooldridge recently, and he said if you get a Trump White House and Marine Le Pen also wins in France, then you could have actually a post-Brexit benefit. Lots of businesses flooding to the UK.
OK, but it's an if. Of course, sometimes the relations between Downing Street and White House and the White House have been pretty cosy. You can think about Tony Blair and George W. Bush, David Cameron and Barack Obama. But then over the weekend, the now Foreign Secretary David Cameron was pretty awkward when he was asked what it will be like to deal with Donald Trump if he actually returns to the White House. Someone that Cameron has described as protectionist, xenophobic and misogynistic. Now, here was his response to the BBC.
We have to make that relationship work. It's one of the things that actually helps to keep us safe in the world. It's not some grandiloquent gesture by the United Kingdom. What I care about is, do we have the intelligence? Do we have the information? Do we have the partnerships to keep our own people and our own country safe? And that relationship with America is absolutely vital in doing that. So whatever the Americans choose to do, we will have to try and make it work.
We're going to be discussing all of this with a former UK civil servant. It's actually an American. She ran diplomatic relations with US presidential candidates in 2016. So her view on what this current US presidential race could look like. Also, we'll be joined by an ex-FBI chief on the cybersecurity risks around the vote. What can we learn that would apply then to the UK election, especially in terms of the risks from artificial intelligence?
But first, we wanted to get a sense of what's actually happening in the US. So we invited someone on to give us a flavour of what we're missing.
It is our very own American in London, Bloomberg TV anchor Kriti Gupta, who is actually a recent arrival from New York and has spent the past few months dealing with the shock of how many differences there are actually between the two countries. Kriti, welcome as ever. If you were doing a letter from London rather than a letter from America, which again is going to need a bit of unpacking for the American, of course, famously a BBC programme, what would you say that British people get wrong about the US election looking stateside?
I'm proud to say I'm the worst adjusted expat in this newsroom, admittedly. I think that's something that they get wrong often is just how intrinsic some of these issues are that I think from the outside feels very far right, driven by President Trump. But I think when you look at some of the core issues, for example, like gun control, like abortion, like immigration, it's baked into over 200 years of just very different mentalities between the East Coast, the middle of the United States, and of course the South, which has very different demographics when it comes to immigration, when it comes to race, ethnicity, when it even comes to access to education, things like that are actually driving some of these changes on the U.S. political scene. So, for example, when you look at perhaps this rise of the right and this rise of support for President Trump that looks so different than his campaign in 2016 when he initially ran, you can start to see that a lot of these issues have been boiling over for decades. And I think gun control, for example, is one that gets a lot of attention internationally, just given the U.S. has such a different take on it than right here in the U.K. or in Europe. And a lot of it is at its core a question of big government versus small government. And that is something that even when you look at the read through into markets or economies is coming to the forefront simply because of things like fiscal austerity. All of these things are connected, but they have been for, decades.
Okay, so gun control, always a theme in US elections, but what are going to be the key battle lines in this US election? Because here in the UK, both of the main parties want it to be, as the Americans say, about the economy, stupid.
A very famous James Carville quote, who of course was the strategist for several campaigns, as was his wife, by the way, for the opposing side. It's a very cute love story, I should mention. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that a lot of the issues that are kind of hot points within the country are hot points outside of the country as well. I'll give you an example. China is one that comes up often as we talk about some sort of reiteration of a trade war with a Republican president in office, whether that's President Trump or Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis. At its core, it's still an issue because if you look at some of the concerns that a lot of people have in terms of immigration, well, there's a lot of Chinese immigrants that come to the United States. If you look at things like border control, fentanyl has been a big sticking point in terms of how the border is actually monitored. Another one, for example, and this is why the Iowa caucus is extra interesting, is the agricultural exports that come from the United States, from in particularly the Midwest, and then go to China. How much of Chinese consumerism and Chinese need for American goods is actually supporting some of the pricing within the United States?
Kriti, I lived in the States for 7 years, almost 8 years, at a time where the political background was, it seemed at the time, and for some voters, very much more positive because it was the era of President Obama just before his election and when he won. What always struck me about travelling across the US, I was amazed at how much money, how much time that individual people would put into politics in the US. And, you know, America is not particularly cynical, even though there is so much money that goes into politics in the US, and to a lot of Europeans, a lot of Brits, that's quite sort of off-putting. I mean, there are some big differences. If you were to give anyone survival tips, any Brits, in terms of following the election, what would they be?
Look the other way until November. That feels
really?
like the way to go. But I'm kidding. I think when you look at the amount of money, to your point, that has been spent on some of these campaigns, it is eye-watering. And so much of it speaks to just how much of a media presence there is in the United States, more so and at a bigger scale than there is in any other part of the world. I think when you look at perhaps some of the survival tips of following some of this money, look at the big donors, the big backings in the coming months as we get more clarity on where presidents, CEOs, big players in industry, actually who they're throwing their weight behind. I think it'll be more clear about how some of these policies of various candidates gets tweaked. I think the best example here is Nikki Haley very famously has gotten the backing of Charles Koch, who is seen as a grassroots libertarian leader. It's unclear how much funding has been funneled through to her campaign from that, but simply the fact that he's very vocal about her being the right move and the right next step for the GOP is pretty telling. And I imagine you'll have some pretty big names that'll follow.
Yeah, and I think that opacity about funding is also a real hallmark of US politics, just as on an individual level. You know, I was so struck by the kind of hope and optimism that Americans have, that they show up to the rallies and they put the signs in the front yard and they pay, you know, individually. There's a lot of fundraising that goes on. Individuals hand over their hard-earned money to people who might be actually quite a long way away in Washington, D.C.
But that's what speaks so much about even the weather issues you're seeing in Iowa. People will come out in full force. And to your point about the spending, I mean, one of the major metrics that a lot of people are looking at in terms of success for Iowa is how much money is being spent on positive ads versus negative ads. And I think this is a really big number that struck out to me. $48.5 million being spent on negative advertising just for Ron DeSantis. If you look at that stat for kind of net, the positive ads versus the negative ads, Nikki Haley is out front by about 14 million. Ron DeSantis is in negative territory. And even that could swing not only polling, but the outcome of the election.
Yeah, massive money, but also massive population. It blows my mind that our entire population is about the same as Michigan's.
Yeah.
All right, our American in London, Kriti Gupta, our Bloomberg TV anchor, we thank you for that very interesting context.
So we mentioned Iowa. Well, this is where the first Republican caucus will take place today. So what should politicians in the UK be watching out for in what is going to be an immensely long presidential campaign? Stephen Carroll and I were speaking to Shannon Felton Spence, who is now the Director of Global Communications and Strategy for the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Centre. But back in 2016, she was working actually at the UK Embassy, the consulate in the US in Boston, and she was tasked with following the election campaigns for the British diplomatic service, reporting back and so on. And we started by asking her actually what that job involved.
Your listeners will be maybe surprised to learn that sort of all of the governments that have diplomatic presence in the U.S. are doing that same game, which is outreaching to the campaigns in order to, one, horizon scan and be able to feed that back into your ambassador and your foreign secretary and sort of let them know what you think is going on, and really using that expertise and those contacts and sources to give them a leg up and sort of knowing what's going to happen in the election. But then the second thing is making those contacts for when one of those candidates will become the president. And the lines of communication are then a little bit more open than they would be if you just ignored them the whole time. So I was the head of politics and communication at the British consulate in the New England states. So I covered the 6 New England states. I was there from 2013 to 2016. And I had the immense pleasure of covering the New Hampshire First in the Nation primary for the 2016 election, which starts very, very early. We actually started traveling up there in January 2015, and we're there all the way to actual primary day, which is in the middle of January, so 2016.
Wow. Okay. So, yes. It's always so surprising, isn't it, that the election campaign in the US is simply so long from a UK perspective. What should politicians in London be preparing themselves for then, if we look actually now at the US presidential race?
It's such a good question. It's hard to say because there's no precedent for what we're dealing with this time. We basically have 2 incumbent presidents that are going head to head. We also have one that is battling legally from every direction. So I think that the media likes to run with this foregone conclusion narrative that it's going to be a rematch of 2020 with President Trump and President Biden. I think that it is extremely likely that that is the case, but I also think that the Republican primary is going to get drawn out a lot longer than if it were truly as settled as the polls suggest, because these court cases are going to begin to eat into his electability. And the one talking point that I think Nikki Haley really has is, do you want a rematch of 2020 where Trump loses to Biden, or my poll numbers show that I can beat President Biden by 19 points. And I think that that is going to start to gain steam, especially as the field starts to consolidate more. So we're in for a longer haul than I think is the prevailing narrative at the moment.
I think with the Republican caucus in mind, that I think that's interesting because, as you say, there is this feeling that Donald Trump, because, you know, the front runner considered by many measures, in that, as you say, to not kind of see that as a foregone conclusion. I'm curious as to what you were reporting back to London about Donald Trump in 2016, and I suppose how different things might look now.
Yeah, can you see my face? So we started, like I said, in January 2015, which is a full year ahead of time. And I was thinking as I was coming to your studio, who were we excited about then? Who were we excited about? And it was actually sort of hard to remember. It feels like a long time ago now. But it was an open ticket because President Obama had termed out. And so we had 2 open primaries that both happened on the same day. On the Republican side, we were excited about Jeb Bush back then. And he was smart and kind, and he was up in New Hampshire a lot, and he was from Florida, which always has a strategic advantage. We spent a lot of time with Marco Rubio. The sense was, if I'm being totally candid, the sense very early on was that his campaign staff in New Hampshire were the staff that didn't get hired at Jeb Bush, didn't get hired at Ted Cruz, and they were sort of not even the B team, they were sort of the Z team. And we still spoke with them, and we were neutral and sort of had all those conversations that we had with the other candidates, but you felt like it wasn't as serious until I think the fall. The candidates started spending more time in New Hampshire themselves, and it became pretty clear that the Jeb Bushes of the world, the Ted Cruzes of the world, were having events in school gymnasiums, and Donald Trump was having to rent out arenas. And you would go to those arenas, and people had taken their kids out of school to be there to see it. And they were wearing MAGA gear and Trump gear, and it had a totally different atmosphere and crowd.
I remember that time. You kind of bring it back to mind, don't you? But the issue now, though, in a way, is that because President Trump was such a different candidate, such a sort of media personality who then became president, this time around, perhaps things are going to be, quite different. Already, people like Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank, very serious figure in many respects, raising the worry around what a second Trump presidency might mean economically, might mean for defence, for Europe. I wonder what you think about now in terms of these campaigns in the US, whether they're listening to the British government, because there's this other strand in the UK that says President Trump loved coming to England. We know, obviously, we're so familiar with his golf courses in Scotland. President Biden has a connection to Ireland, quite a strong connection to Ireland, that is going to be very, very important. How much are the campaigns listening to the UK government's desires?
Well, of course they do. The UK is the US's, longest and strongest ally, and the collaboration goes so far and deep. People often used to ask me, as an American, what's it like working for another government? I said, it's very easy to work for the Brits. We sort of believe the same things and have the same values. The thing is that we did not take note of in 2016 when I say that he was renting out arenas and people were bringing their kids, is we looked around that room and thought, but these aren't the voters that show up. They are here for the spectacle, and they are here because this famous guy who was on The Apprentice is here. But these aren't the people that show up. But actually, they have showed up for him. They've showed up for him again and again and again. And there was a great piece in Politico, American Politico, a couple days ago about how Nikki Haley is gaining a lot of momentum. But you can't find anybody at a Nikki Haley rally that doesn't have a university degree or even a graduate degree. And you can't go to a Trump rally and find anybody that has one. And so this is actually becoming a very deep societal class issue that is seeping into politics. And that's a much bigger thing that I feel like we're just starting to grasp.
What should, if you were doing the job that you were doing in 2016 today, what would your key advice be to the government here when looking at the lineup of candidates from both parties?
We made a mistake not taking him seriously and thinking that it was a spectacle. And we watched everyone around us make that same mistake. Certainly, the person that has the job now would not be making that mistake, and the governments are not making that mistake. But it bit us because then he became president and we didn't have any of those serious contacts, at least from my side. You're playing from behind at that point. And so I think that they're not making that same mistake. I think that they are outreaching and making contact and making sure that the Trump campaign is aware of the UK's priorities and those collaboration points. But that's the biggest thing. We can't just watch him from the sidelines. We have to take it very seriously.
So that was Shannon Felton Spence there, who is the Director of Global Communications and Strategy for the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. So really interesting in terms of her on-the-ground experience, sort of reporting back to the UK.
Well, speaking of someone who's been tracking the US election closely, is Nigel Farage. He's been speaking about the Iowa caucus in the run-up to that vote. Take a listen.
I'm a huge Donald Trump supporter. I have been absolutely from the start. I've never wavered in the view that America needs him, and I think the Western world needs him. I genuinely think we need strong leaders. I think Trump's economic policies were very, very successful. He was knocked sideways by COVID, but then any person that was in a leadership role during that period had a difficult time. I genuinely don't think that Putin would have invaded Ukraine if Trump had been there.
So that was Nigel Farage, the British politician who was, of course, a chief engineer of Britain's exit from the European Union. So what happens in the US bleeds over into UK politics, as we hear from Nigel Farage. Trump pleading with voters to back him in Iowa with Nigel Farage in tow. Now, if social media changed the electoral landscape in 2008, artificial intelligence could really change it in 2024. But what are the dangers and how could it actually enhance democracy? Well, joining us now to discuss is Chief Security Officer at CrowdStrike, Shawn Henry. Shawn, you oversaw half of the FBI's investigative operations and you also managed computer crime investigations across the globe. What are the online threats that you're most worried about in this US election?
Well, I think that we've seen foreign adversaries targeting U.S. elections going back to at least 2008 from an electronic perspective. And going forward, we expect that to happen again. It happened in 2016. We saw attacks in 2018, 2020. The adversaries are very interested in disrupting democracy, and they're looking to sow division within the United States. While we have concerns that parts of the electoral process may be targeted in terms of trying to manipulate actual votes or trying to disrupt the tallying of votes, probably the largest concern is misinformation, where adversaries are putting out information that is inaccurate, that is manufactured, and that is caused specifically to create chaos in the United States.
Has that gotten worse? And what is the worst case scenario for that, in your view?
I think it has gotten worse because there are more people that are involved. Originally, we saw this misinformation campaign for the first time in 2016 with Russia targeting the Democratic National Committee. What we have seen subsequent to that are other nations that have been involved in that same type of activity, China and Iran specifically. The big push towards generative AI, which will allow other organizations to get involved in this type of activity because it's made it much easier for them to create the ability to change information and to push it out at scale. And we expect those deep fakes to become much more visible and much more credible. And that is going to change the landscape of the election.
What do you think of the big platforms, obviously US platforms, Facebook, X, Instagram, and how they're actually dealing with disinformation, misinformation, and malicious actors?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Each of these organizations has policies and processes in place on how they deal with it. Some deal with it much better than others. And we've seen their policies change over the years. There's been allegations of the government being involved in asking companies to take certain things down. And was that always done with the right intention or not? So there's a lot of speculation around how those rules are applied. I think it's critically important that these networks are involved in understanding how their platforms are being utilized and how they're being monitored in a way that there is some integrity around the data that they're hosting. That typically takes a lot of resources. While you can use AI and other technology to identify some of these fakes, oftentimes it requires a human being to get involved to actually go through and look for some of the signs that data has been manipulated or changed. So some of these social media platforms are, while they're more engaged, there are others, I think, that are a bit more reluctant to invest in that effort.
Of course, the internet doesn't have borders. We're likely to get a UK election the same month as America's. Shawn, how far do online tactics and harms bleed over from the US into our election process here in the UK?
This is a global issue. It's not a US issue. There are more than 40 democratic elections around the globe this year in 2024 in not only the US and the UK, but India, South Africa, Taiwan, we just saw happen. And there have been allegations that China was involved in trying to manipulate that particular election. I think that democracy is on the ballot. The adversaries, when we talk about Russia, China, Iran being the primary adversaries in this space, they want to impact democracy. While the U.S., of course, is one of their primary targets, it's not just the only target. They are targeting democracy around the world because it helps to support their goals, their objectives, and it is a key mission for these organizations. And we've seen them involved in activity across the globe.
I mean, the big social media platforms would surely push back. I mean, you're a cyber technology company. You know, this is your job to make the case, you know, about these warnings and the seriousness of the threat. I mean, you can imagine Facebook, X, Instagram talking about that has to be balanced with the idea of freedom of speech. And there is a real debate about who gets to plant the flag as to how far freedom of speech goes and make those decisions. What would be your response?
Well, there's the freedom of speech clearly is always a major concern. And I, for one, am a believer in free speech, but it has its limits. You know, the old adage, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, is really first and foremost, I think, the example. When speech is completely inaccurate, when it is fomenting division, and it is specifically put out in a way that is intended to change the minds of individuals. And when I say that, when it's manufactured, when it's fraudulent, it's not accurate, and it's put out at scale, I think there's got to be some parameters around that, some framework. It's a slippery slope, obviously. As you've just alluded to, you want to make sure that you're engaged in a way that is protecting democracy and protecting citizens, but you don't want to apply too much pressure that it actually puts that free speech in a box and inhibits others. So it's a challenge for sure, but I think that there needs to be stronger engagement. The general public has to understand where their data is coming from, what the sources are, who the actors are that are putting it out, what the objectives are of those people who are putting information out. They've got to verify and validate what it is they're looking at, listening to, and watching, because this is an area that has huge implications to impact our democracies.
Yeah, I do wonder how you can fortify that trust, given we've just seen the official SEC account, the Securities and Exchange Commission account, hacked on X. And there was also one point when Donald Trump's Twitter account was hacked in 2020. So how do you make that trust on the internet in official sources?
Well, I think with those two examples, it appears that there was some type of a brute password attack. They were able to identify the credentials and use them to access the X account. I think it's incumbent upon individuals and corporations to make sure that they're putting their best foot forward. They're using appropriate defenses to protect their networks. Again, I think in that case, when the security fails because the individuals are compromised, they're socially engineered, I think that the consumer needs to look at what they're seeing and to verify and validate. It's very, very hard. We're getting hit by information 24/7. It's coming to us from so many different sides. There's so many new platforms that are coming into play. And people are obtaining their information from so many different devices that it's really hard to validate and verify. But it's the world that we live in now, and adversaries are absolutely exploiting vulnerabilities that we have, and they're going to continue to do that going forward.
One of the vulnerabilities I think we perceive and understand in the UK and in Europe at large also is that the size of our economies and our populations is so much smaller, and there isn't perhaps the depth of resource that maybe the US has to deal with this. When you think about the UK election, and again, the UK kind of limits big money influence domestically, and yet we're in this soup of the online world. How should the UK think about an upcoming general election year? What would you be most worried about for Britain?
Well, beyond the disinformation campaign that we see, we know that attackers have in the past targeted portions of networks to try and disrupt or impact elections. So they've targeted political campaigns and the information technology enterprises that are associated with elections, administrative entities, those sorts of things. So I think that the first and foremost organizations have to make sure that they've got the appropriate securities in place. They've got to have technology that helps them to identify anomalous or unusual behavior on the network, because you've got to secure the actual electronic digital piece first. And that's really important, because adversaries are, without a doubt, targeting those environments. Beyond that, I think that there's got to be a public education. There's got to be discussion in public. I think that discussions like this, the broadcast that you're doing, to let people understand what the risks are, what the impacts will be. And I don't think that you can underestimate the value of an educated populace. People need to know that they are being targeted. I said recently that it's not just networks that are being hacked, it's the human mind is being hacked with this type of information that adversaries are going to try and push out in a way to change the view and to disrupt the way people think and the way people interact. And that is a dangerous, dangerous game.
Well, you've got me thinking, what a bleak thought to end on. Shawn Henry, Chief Security Officer at CrowdStrike. Great to have you on the podcast. Thank you.
So that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Yes, on social media.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock and our audio engineer was Marufal Hussain. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.